Welcome to the Reasonable Christianity Podcast, a weekly podcast where you get to discover the truth claims, teachings, and practices of Christianity. Here's your host, Roland. Hello friends and welcome back to Reasonable Christianity. Now, today's episode is going to be a little bit different. This isn't going to be one of our usual episodes where we discuss theology, philosophy, or apologetics. We won't be debating a worldview or dismantling an argument or working through a doctrinal controversy like we usually do. This is going to be more reflective than that, more devotional even, hopefully more contemplative. So, as you guys know, over the past few days, the past week or two, many people here in the Western Cape have had to live through the reality of severe storms and flooding. Many homes were obviously damaged. Roads were broken, farms were submerged in water, and many families were displaced. There was naturally a lot of fear, uncertainty, and very real vulnerability. And so, as I reflected on what many people were experiencing, my mind kept turning towards Pentecost because the worst of the flood actually came about a week and a half before the day of Pentecost, or before we as Christians celebrate the day of Pentecost. And so now I know at first it may sound like an unusual connection, but the more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that there is a profound symbolic contrast between the meaning of Pentecost, or what it represents, and the Western Cape flood and storms in general. Now, obviously, I need to be clear here and say that I don't think, and I don't believe that every storm is a kind of coded message from heaven, a conspiracy or something like that. No. And I need to say this from the outset because I don't want to flatten the suffering of people and kind of make it fit into a neat spiritual lesson. And I definitely don't want to think of the pain of real people as being turned into a spectacle. So that's not the intention here. I think that would be maybe shallow and even cruel. But the Bible does give us certain language for reflecting on reality. It often gives us imagery. It speaks about fire. It speaks about water, about breath. It speaks about wind. It says a lot about harvest and darkness and light, chaos and order, creation and redemption. So, when we think about the flood, we think about Pentecost through that biblical language, they stand in striking contrast to one another. Pentecost speaks of life. It speaks of first fruits. The flood speaks about destruction. It speaks about ruined fields. Pentecost, again, for example, speaks about the presence of God, but the flood confronts us with the fragility of creation. When we read about the day of Pentecost, and even its Hebraic roots in the feast of Shavuot, it speaks about warmth and gathering, about fruitfulness and renewal. Whereas in the Bible, particularly and in our experience in the Western Cape flood, when we speak about a flood, we speak about coldness, dislocation, disruption, and loss. So, this is the contrast I want us to reflect on today. And I want us to do so in terms of symbolic meditation. So, I need to say this from the outset. This is not a prophetic proclamation I'm making. Oftentimes, the Bible uses symbols. So, the Bible would take real events or real things that exist in the real world and then extract a theological or philosophical meaning from that real event or that real object. Jesus often does this in his parables. Now, when you look at the biblical use of symbolism, often that symbolism also carries with it a prophetic element, particularly as it relates to Jesus. For example, when we spoke about the temple was a real place. It was a real structure. But it also had symbolic meaning. it was the place where the Spirit of God dwelt, which means that anywhere where the Spirit of God dwells becomes a temple. But then it also has a prophetic element, because the temple was showing forward or looking forward to the fulfillment in Christ. And when Christ fulfilled being the temple, when he gave us the Spirit, we then become the temple. So there's this symbolic element, meaning there's a real temple. That temple has symbolic meaning, but it also has prophetic implications. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to speak about the flood and Pentecost in a symbolic way. I don't have any intention to extract any prophetic meaning from it. I wouldn't presume to do that. At least not in the way we hear so-called prophets use the word prophetic. When we studied the spiritual gifts in a few episodes earlier, I made it clear that the prophetic gift in the New Testament is about encouraging and comforting believers by giving them revelation that the speaker couldn't have by himself. So perhaps God will use this episode in that sense, but my intention is simply to draw a symbolic contrast between Pentecost and the flood. Now, in order for us to understand Pentecost properly, we need to remember that Pentecost did not begin in Acts 2. Laat ek dit in Afrikaans sê, Pinkster het nie by in Handelinge 2 begin nie. Okay? We need to understand that Pentecost was already a feast in the Old Testament. Now, I'm going to be very brief here in explaining and kind of setting the context for our discussion about Pentecost. But last year, around the same time, I did a very thorough examination and exegesis and exposition about the Jewish feast Shavuot and its implications in terms of the fulfillment of Pentecost, and then what it means for us as Christians later. So you guys can go and check out that episode as well. I also wrote a few articles where I contrasted the meaning of Pentecost with the LGBTQ movement. So perhaps I'll share all of that in this episode description as well. But the point is, Pentecost was already a feast in the Old Testament. It was the Feast of Weeks, which is Shavuot. It was a harvest celebration, a first fruit celebration. Okay? So this particular feast came during the wheat harvest, and it was a time of thanksgiving, a time of abundance and of provision. And that matters a lot, because Pentecost is not first and foremost about emotional experience as we've come to learn, or as we've come to know it by. When we look at the Pentecostal movement, you would think that Pentecost is about ecstatic utterances, supernatural events, supernatural experiences with God, and emotional highs. No. Pentecost isn't merely or primarily or mainly about spiritual excitement. Pentecost is rooted in the goodness of cultivated creation that yields life. So think of the imagery surrounding this particular feast. There are fields, harvest, bread, fruitfulness, things like provision and abundance. Because Pentecost is an agricultural feast. And this is important for us living in the Western Cape, where a lot of South Africa's agricultural goods come from. Think about that for a moment. So, again, Pentecost is about the earth bringing forth life under the blessing of God. And that's again why the flooding in the Western Cape became such a powerful counter-image. Because instead of fields yielding fruit, we saw fields submerged in water. Instead of harvest, we saw destruction. Instead of cultivated order, we saw broken roads, we saw damaged farms and unstable ground. And so when Pentecost says creation is under God's blessing and is yielding first fruits, flood imagery says that creation is being overwhelmed. Therefore, Pentecost celebrates life, whereas the flood, or a flood, threatens life. Pentecost is a sign of fruitfulness. Floods are often a sign of loss. And that contrast is already enough to make an analogy meaningful. But the Bible takes us even deeper than that. So hopefully you stay with me, guys, as we explore these images. Because the Bible has a theology of water. Let me be clear. I'm not saying every use of water in the Bible is negative. No, we see instances in the Bible where water can cleanse, water can refresh people, water can heal, and water can baptize. Water can obviously sustain life as well. But when we speak about untamed water, when we speak about chaotic water, flood water, for example, sea water or storm water, these often symbolize something different, something else. They symbolize disorder. They symbolize instability and threat, a kind of undoing of boundaries. And that pattern begins at the very beginning of the Bible. So in Genesis 1, the earth is described as formless and void, with darkness over the face of the deep. Think about that image in your mind. That image is not an image of peace. That image is one of unformed chaos. And then think about what happens after that image. The Spirit of God hovers over the waters. That is a foundational biblical picture. Why? Because the Spirit brings order where there is chaos. It brings life where there is emptiness. And it brings structure where there is formlessness. So, when we look at the creation narrative, creation itself begins with God overcoming disorder and bringing a habitable world into being. So from the very opening chapter of the Bible, we see this pattern. There are chaotic waters that threaten order, and then the Spirit of God brings life. The same pattern appears later in the flood narrative of Noah. Because the flood isn't just rainfall. No, symbolically, it is creation collapsing backward. The boundaries between land and sea are undone. The ordered world is submerged. The earth returns towards chaos. Guys, this is a picture once again of decreation. Because the world begins to lose its form, its stability, and its fruitfulness. The world begins to lose its very boundaries between land and sea. And when we saw the Western Cape flood, we saw images that instinctively should remind us of that same symbolic world. Submerged land, damaged infrastructure, isolated communities, drowned fields, the breaking of ordinary life. Again, I'm not saying the storm was the same thing as Noah's flood, guys. I'm not making a quote-unquote prophetic declaration. I'm not claiming prophetic certainty. And I don't want to use the suffering of people as a stage for speculation, as I see so many quote-unquote prophets do. What I'm saying is much simpler and more grounded than that. I'm just saying that human beings instinctively recognize flood imagery as overwhelming because the Bible has trained us to see chaotic waters as a symbol of instability, as a symbol of fragility and of undoing order. So storms often humble us because they expose how thin the layer of normal life really is. We often live as though, and we think the world is solid. We think our systems are secure. We think our roads, our houses, our farms, and our routines will hold. And then the water comes. And suddenly we remember how fragile everything is. And that is why Pentecost is such a powerful counter image again. At Pentecost, the Spirit comes in again, but this time not over the waters of chaos in Genesis, and not in the form of judgmental submersion, but upon gathered people, forming them into a renewed people under the presence of God. So, in Acts 2, there's wind, there's fire, there's speech, there's a gathering of the people of God, and there's communion. There is life, guys. When you look at that imagery is warm, it's alive, it's active, and it's fruitful. Pentecost, unlike the flood, is not cold. It's not isolating. It's not disorienting in the way flood waters are disorienting. It's not the invasion of chaos. No, it's the descent of the presence of God. And I want to kind of invite us to stand still a bit and focus on fire, because fire matters here. Because in scripture, fire isn't only destructive. Fire often symbolizes divine presence. It symbolizes holiness and purification, even illumination and nearness. We think of things like the burning bush, like the pillar of fire. Think of Mount Sinai, even tongues of fire at Pentecost. Often in the Bible, fire means that God is near. Fire means God is active and God is present among his people. So, again, Pentecost isn't just about power. It's about presence. It's the moment God begins to dwell among a renewed people in a new way. And that is what makes the contrast again with the flood so vivid. Because Pentecost feels like heaven touching earth with warmth, but the flood feels like earth sliding backward towards instability. Now, that symbolic contrast is powerful because it doesn't require us to speak irresponsibly. It simply allows us to meditate on the biblical meaning of these images. But there's another layer I want to share with you guys as well. So, at Pentecost, language itself is healed. And I mentioned this, I think, in some previous episodes as well. This harkens back to what happens at the Tower of Babel. Because there, humanity is fragmented, speech is confused, and people are scattered. Communication broke down, but at Pentecost, that scattering begins to be reversed. The Spirit actually enables understanding. People from many nations hear the mighty works of God in their own languages. And the gathered crowd is not erased in its diversity, but united in its worship. And that matters again, guys, because Pentecost is not only about fire, it's also about communion. And I'm going to keep saying this, it's about unity. It's about shared hearing, shared life, and shared praise. I've often attended Pentecostal services and seen these ecstatic events and emotional and exciting events happen. But it often looks to me like a bunch of individuals coming together in the room and sharing an experience, but they don't belong to one another. They don't have communion with one another. They don't have fellowship. But Pentecost is about gathering, not fragmentation. Whereas, like I mentioned, a flood does the opposite. So I think that contrast gives the analogy real depth. Now, I think it's important for us to move from the biblical symbolism into the experience of lived reality, because there's another reason storms unsettle us so deeply. They don't just damage things. Again, they expose something about the world that modern people try very hard to forget. And here's the truth it exposes. It exposes the fact that creation is not yet fully healed. It reminds me of Romans 8, where Paul says that creation itself groans. Not just human beings, creation itself. Because it's subjected to futility. It is in bondage to corruption. So creation awaits with longing for redemption. Paul even compares this waiting to labor pains. Again, this is striking language because it means that creation is not neutral. But it also means that creation is not yet finished. Not finished. I'm not speaking about finished as the way the Bible speaks about it being finished in Genesis. It means that God is still creating something. It's not fully at rest. When Genesis speaks about God creating the physical world and he says God rested, that's because the physical world was completed. But God is busy creating a new heavens and a new earth. And I was speaking to my wife about this the other day. When it says new heavens and new earth, this is creation language again. It doesn't mean heaven as in the place where God lives. It means a new universe. And so when storms can come, they can awaken that awareness in a very direct way. This idea that creation is not yet finished. God is still busy with us. Creation is groaning. When roads vanish, when homes flood and power fails, even when farmland disappears underwater, we are reminded that our world is more fragile than we think. Civilization is real, yes, but it's not ultimate. Stability, or the stability that we perceive, is precious, but it's not self-sustaining. And that human control is partial and temporary. So floods have a unique way of stripping away the illusion of permanence. And they remind us that we are dependent creatures. And that can obviously be very frightening. But I think it can always also be very clarifying. Because dependence is not a weakness in the biblical story. No, dependence is simply a fact of creaturely life. It just means that we are not the ultimate authority. We are not the ultimate sovereign. We are not self-creating. We are not self-preserving. We are sustained by God. And this again brings into question the character of God and our trust in God. The reason why dependence on God is not something to fear is because God is altogether lovely, is altogether good. He is all-powerful and all good, which means He can accomplish all His desired outcomes, and all His desired outcomes are good. But modern life often hides that from us. We have curated a life, an existence, where everything feels managed, engineered, scheduled, and controlled. But storms break through that illusion, and they reveal that our footing is less secure than we imagine if we don't trust in God, if we trust in ourselves. And in that revelation, again, there is both grief and truth, because the grief is real, the losses are real. When floods come, fear is real, disruption is real, but the truth is also real. And the truth is that creation is still groaning, and we are still waiting for the final restoration. And that's why Pentecost matters so much in a groaning world. Because Pentecost tells us that God has not abandoned creation to chaos. The Spirit has been given as the first fruits of a coming kingdom, of a manifesting kingdom. That means that Pentecost is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of something. It's a pledge, a sign, a down payment, a kind of foretaste. And this is why the Spirit of God is called our guarantee. Paul calls the Holy Spirit our guarantee. And so the Spirit descending on the people of God means that restoration has already begun. Not completed, but begun. This is often why the Bible speaks about our salvation in different states. It speaks about us being saved already. It speaks about us having been saved. It also speaks about us going to be saved in the future, which theologians then contrast or distinctively name justification, sanctification, and glorification. We are justified, we have been saved, meaning we have been made right with God. We are in right standing with God. But it doesn't mean that we in ourselves are holy. We still need to be conformed to the image of Christ. That's where sanctification comes in. But ultimately, when Christ returns in full glory, we will be made to look like Him completely. And that will be our glorification. And I think that distinction is crucial. Because it means that, and I mentioned this in the previous episode, it means that Christianity and our hope as Christians is not in escapism. The hope is not in us somehow abandoning the world. And this is also important when it comes to our eschatology, when it speaks about the rapture and these kinds of things. Christians kind of enduring suffering, enduring this world in a reluctant way with the hope of escaping this world. No, that's not our hope. Our hope is not leaving creation behind. The biblical story begins with creation, and then creation falls into corruption, and it ends with a renewed creation. So the final hope is not that matter or the material world will be discarded. The final hope is that the material world, that history and creation itself will be healed, will be renewed. Which means that Pentecost then also points us forward. It points us forward to the day when the groaning will end, to the day when corruption is no more. It points us forward to the day when fire no longer feels like a distant symbol, but the living presence of God indwells everything. Not in the same, I'm not speaking about the way maybe Hindus would speak about, or pantheists would speak about the presence of God indwelling everything. I mean that the glory of God will be visible throughout His created universe. And that's what makes the contrast again with the flood so significant, because the flood reminds us that the world is wounded. Pentecost reminds us that the world is being reclaimed. The flood points to fragility. Pentecost points to promise. And so the flood says creation is not yet at peace, and Pentecost says God has already begun the work of making peace. And there's another deeply human dimension to the symbolism of fire and water. Again, like I mentioned, Pentecost is warm, floods are cold. And again, it may sound simple, but it's emotionally true and spiritually resonant. Warmth gathers, cold isolates. Warmth invites, cold often distances. So Pentecost is warmth in more ways than one. It's warmth of the presence of God, but it's also warmth of gathering the people of God, warmth of communion and of the Spirit of God. And that contrast itself becomes a meditation on what creation is meant to be under God's blessing. Because God created the world not to be cold or disordered, but to be filled with life and fruitfulness, nearness and peace. And that's why I keep coming back to the phrase anti-Pentecost. Because the timing is also significant, that the flood came a week and a half or so before the day of Pentecost, before we celebrate the day of Pentecost. And I don't want to make you guys think or use the flood as a kind of mystical opposite force of Pentecost in itself. I'm just pointing out that symbolically it represents a reversal of the life-giving imagery associated with Pentecost, which means that Pentecost again is creation filled with divine life, whereas the flood feels like creation overwhelmed by disorder. Now, as we kind of draw this episode to a close, I think this is where the devotional value of this reflection really lies. Because we are not meant to look at storms and become superstitious. We're not meant to read every flood as a direct message with a hidden code. Not every flood is God directly judging a people. I'm not saying that. It might be, but I'm not saying that. But we are meant to notice when creation itself confronts us with symbolic realities that the Bible already teaches us to recognize. And I've mentioned this throughout this episode. Water can overwhelm, fire can illuminate. Chaos can undo, whereas the Spirit can renew. And this is the story that these images tell. And in the end, Pentecost is not merely a remembrance of a past event. It is a declaration about the future of reality. The Spirit has come. The kingdom has begun. The first fruits have arrived. And the final harvest is still ahead. So when flood water rises, it doesn't get the final word. When fields are damaged, they don't get the final word. When roads collapse, when creation groans, that is not the final word. Because the last note, the last crescendo, the last word belongs to Christ. And the Spirit who came at Pentecost is the guarantee that chaos will not reign forever. So, I want to close with this. Many of us in the Western Cape have watched the rain fall and waters rise. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, I found myself in the midst of it. And it made me think about Pentecost. It made me have a deeper appreciation for Pentecost. Because Pentecost is not just a church word. It's not just a theological date on the calendar. It's a picture of God bringing life, warmth, of God bringing harvest and presence into a world that still knows cold, loss, fragility, and grief. Again, the flood reminds us that creation is wounded, but Pentecost reminds us that creation is not abandoned. And so, perhaps the right posture in this time isn't panic. It's not superstition, and it's not despair. The right posture is reverence, gratitude, humility, and compassion, even hope. So we have compassion for those who have suffered. We have humility before creation. We have gratitude for every sign of preservation. And we have hope that the God who sends His Spirit has not finished His work. Because, again, even Pentecost itself is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of restoration. And that means even in the middle of storms, the people of God can live as witnesses to another kind of reality. A reality that's marked by warmth, by the presence of God, by peace, and by life. And this is what it means to be the ecclesia. This is what it means to be the fullness of Christ. All right, thank you guys for listening. This has been a shorter episode. It's a more reflective episode, just to show us that we can draw hope, because our God is busy actively renewing us. The one who started a good work in us will be faithful to complete it. And as always, I finish this episode by reminding you guys of the undeniable reality that the truth matters. And so do you.